On a foggy morning in 1972, an Eastern Airlines Lockheed L-1011 TriStar approached Miami International Airport. The pilots sat with their hands off the controls as the jet descended smoothly through zero visibility. The plane landed itself, a fully automatic touchdown, something no other airliner in the world could do at the time. This was aviation's future, arriving decades early. While most airliners of the early 1970s, the Boeing 747, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, even the brand new Airbus A300, still relied on pilots wrestling throttles and yokes in poor weather, the TriStar promised computers that could think faster, fly smoother, and make flying safer than ever before. Lockheed executives boasted that if the technology they needed didn't exist, they would simply invent it. And that's exactly what they did. They built the most advanced widebody of its generation. And yet, 20 years later, Autoland was still rare in commercial aviation, and the TriStar had already been retired from production. The jet that should have changed everything became Lockheed's most disastrous bet, not because it failed in the skies, but because airlines refused to buy it. Lockheed's boldest move turned out to be its most dangerous. Unlike McDonnell Douglas or Boeing, who offered airlines a choice of engines, Lockheed tied the TriStar exclusively to one, the Rolls-Royce RB211. On paper, it was a masterpiece. This was a three-shaft turbofan, the first of its kind, promising unheard-of efficiency, quieter cabins, and lower emissions. For a jet meant to embody the future, the RB211 looked like the perfect partner. But in 1971, the dream nearly imploded. Rolls-Royce, stretched by the cost of developing the RB211, declared bankruptcy. The British government was forced to step in with a bailout, nationalizing the company to keep the program alive. For Lockheed, the timing was catastrophic. With the L-1011 already in production, suddenly every delivery date slipped by years. Airlines hated the risk. Buying an aircraft tied to a single, bankrupt engine supplier was a gamble few were willing to take. By contrast, McDonnell Douglas's DC-10 could be ordered with either the General Electric CF6 or Pratt & Whitney JT9D, the same engines that powered Boeing's 747. Airlines loved that flexibility. They could standardize maintenance across fleets and hedge against supply problems. The TriStar, meanwhile, was chained to a single supplier, drowning in debt. Lockheed executives like Daniel Houghton fought desperately to reassure customers, but confidence was gone. Even with the British bailout, the RB211 delays meant McDonnell Douglas surged ahead with deliveries. By the time the first production L-1011 entered service with Eastern Airlines in April 1972, the DC-10 was already flying passengers for American Airlines and United. And that was only the beginning of Lockheed's uphill battle. Because while engines nearly broke the TriStar, its real defeat came from rivals who understood the market far better. In the late 1960s, airlines were hungry for wide-bodies. The jet age had exploded demand for long-haul travel, and carriers wanted aircraft that could carry more passengers at lower costs. Lockheed assumed their TriStar would slide neatly into the middle of the market, smaller than Boeing's 747, but more capable than any twin. What they didn't realize was that their rivals had already staked out the territory. McDonnell Douglas moved first with the DC-10, rolling out in 1970. They secured massive orders from American Airlines, United, and Northwest, three of the biggest U.S. carriers, before Lockheed even had a production model ready. Across the Atlantic, Airbus, a new European consortium, launched the A300 in 1972 with aggressive government backing. It was the world's first twin-engine widebody, and it targeted short to medium-haul routes where airlines wanted efficiency, not Lockheed's futuristic complexity. And at the top end of the market, Boeing had already won the crown. The 747, powered by Pratt & Whitney's JT9D, was the queen of the skies, and it dominated long-haul transoceanic travel. Pan Am, TWA, Lufthansa, Japan Airlines, they had all committed heavily to Boeing's giant, leaving no space for Lockheed to compete. That left the TriStar stranded in a shrinking niche. By the time Lockheed arrived, the biggest customers were locked up. Airlines asked a brutal question. Why pay more for a high-tech aircraft when the DC-10 and A300 were cheaper, available sooner, and fit their networks better? And even when Lockheed finally delivered the TriStar, that problem didn't go away, because airlines weren't just skeptical about engines or rivals. They didn't believe passengers or crews cared about the futuristic features Lockheed was selling. For airlines in the 1970s, the TriStar was both a marvel and a headache. Lockheed loaded the L-1011 with technology no other jet could match, a fully certified autoland system that could bring the plane down in zero visibility, direct lift control services for perfectly smooth approaches, and triple redundant flight computers that made it almost impossible for a single system failure to bring the jet down. In theory, it was the safest airliner ever built. But those features came at a cost. Every new layer of automation required specialized training for crews, driving up transition expenses for airlines that were already stretched. Maintenance departments had to adapt to unfamiliar electronics, hydraulic redundancies, and components far beyond what the DC-10 or A300 required. In a decade defined by rising fuel prices after the 1973 oil crisis, airlines weren't chasing sophistication, they wanted simplicity and efficiency. McDonnell Douglas marketed the DC-10 as a practical workhorse with proven General Electric and Pratt & Whitney engines. Airbus A300 pitched the A300 as the world's first efficient twin, capable of carrying nearly 270 passengers with 2 engines instead of 3, at a price point that undercut everyone else. Lockheed, by contrast, was asking airlines to pay a premium for safety margins and futuristic features most carriers didn't think passengers would notice. It was a painful irony. The TriStar could fly itself onto a runway through fog, but airlines were counting pennies on fuel bills, not daydreaming about tomorrow's cockpit. And just as Lockheed struggled to sell complexity in an age of austerity, an even more dangerous crisis was about to erupt, one that didn't come from technology, but from Lockheed's own balance sheet. By 1971, Lockheed itself was in danger of collapse. Development of the L-1011 had drained cash reserves, and the delays caused by Rolls-Royce's bankruptcy only deepened the crisis. That year, Lockheed reported staggering losses and turned to Washington for help. In 1971, Congress approved a $250 million loan guarantee to keep the company afloat, a lifeline that became known as the Lockheed bailout. The deal was politically toxic. Lawmakers argued that no private company should be rescued with taxpayer money, while others claimed letting Lockheed fail would cripple America's aerospace industry. The scandal deepened when it emerged that Lockheed executives had been involved in overseas bribery to secure contracts, allegations that touched Japan, the Netherlands, and even Italian politics. For airlines, the optics were disastrous. Why commit to a widebody from a manufacturer teetering on insolvency when Boeing and McDonnell Douglas looked stronger? Carriers like All Nippon Airways and Lufthansa balked at large-scale commitments, preferring to stick with established players. European airlines leaned toward Airbus, confident in its government backing, while U.S. majors doubled down on the DC-10 and 747. Lockheed survived on paper thanks to government intervention, but in the marketplace, its reputation was scarred. The TriStar was now not only the most complex airliner, but the riskiest bet financially. And even as Lockheed tried to steady itself, another storm was forming, one that had nothing to do with money, engines, or even technology. This time, it came from the court of public opinion. Before we move on, I want to hear from you. What do you think of the L-1011? Was it an engineering masterpiece that airlines misunderstood, or was it simply too complicated for its own good? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're enjoying this deep dive into aviation history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. In December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was flying from New York to Miami. During approach, the crew became distracted by a landing gear indicator light. While they focused on the tiny bulb, the autopilot mode slipped, and the jet slowly descended into the Florida Everglades. More than 100 people lost their lives. For Lockheed, it was a nightmare. Even though the crash was caused by crew error and not a flaw in the aircraft itself, the damage to the TriStar's reputation was immediate. To the public, seeing it buried in a swamp just months after entering service left a lasting scar. By comparison, McDonnell Douglas faced disasters that were objectively worse. The DC-10 suffered catastrophic accidents in the 1970s, including Turkish Airlines Flight 981 in 1974, where a cargo door failure over France killed 346 people. That should have crippled confidence in the DC-10. Yet, thanks to a larger customer base and deeper industry relationships, Douglas kept selling hundreds of planes. Lockheed, with fewer buyers and thinner margins for error, couldn't recover as easily. The contrast was brutal. One accident defined the TriStar in the eyes of the public, while multiple accidents didn't stop the DC-10 from dominating. And that raised a bigger question. Was the rejection really about safety, or was it about something much deeper in how the aviation world worked? By the late 1970s, the market for widebodies had already hardened into clear camps. Boeing's 747 was the undisputed champion of long-haul mass travel, filling terminals from New York to Tokyo. A300 offered airlines an efficient, lower-cost option, ideal for shorter transcontinental routes. McDonnell Douglas, meanwhile, secured a solid middle ground with the DC-10, backed by extensive service networks and a strong presence in North America. Lockheed's TriStar, positioned between all of them, never found the audience it needed. It was too big to compete directly with the A300, too small to challenge the 747, and too expensive compared to the DC-10. For international carriers looking at razor-thin margins during the oil crisis, the choice was simple. Buy the jet that saved money, not the one that dazzled engineers. Another factor hurt Lockheed as well. Unlike Boeing or Douglas, Lockheed had no long-standing civil aviation infrastructure across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Its brand was firmly tied to military contracts like the C-130 Hercules and SR-31 Blackbird, not passenger airliners. That lack of trust in global after-sales support made cautious buyers look elsewhere, especially in regions where spare parts and maintenance were critical. By 1984, production of the L-1011 ceased after just 250 aircraft had been built. Lockheed executives quietly stepped away from the civilian airline business altogether, focusing once again on defense projects. And yet, even after airlines closed the book on it, the people who actually flew and rode the TriStar kept its reputation alive. Ask any captain who logged hours on the L-1011, and the response is strikingly consistent. It was one of the smoothest, safest, and most comfortable aircraft ever built. Passengers often praised its quiet cabin, generous seating, and stable ride. Technicians admired the engineering elegance, even if maintaining it came at a higher cost. But airlines don't make decisions based on comfort alone. For executives, the numbers didn't work, the timing didn't align, and the risk outweighed the reward. Lockheed delivered a masterpiece at precisely the wrong moment. During an oil crisis, in a market already divided, with rivals offering simpler and cheaper solutions. The TriStar never became the commercial success Lockheed envisioned. Instead, it stands today as a reminder of aviation's unforgiving truth. Being ahead of your time can be just as dangerous as being behind it. In the end, the L-1011 wasn't rejected because it was flawed. It was rejected because the business of flying isn't about building the best airplane. It's about building the right airplane at the right time.